The news landed on Elon Musk's desk late in the afternoon, dropped there with a sense of urgency by one of his closest internal auditors. It was a small folder, no more than 5 pages, but its contents made it feel heavier than most technical reports or design updates he sifted through daily. The headline was simple, blunt: evidence of internal theft. Not in the billions, not even in the millions, but enough to be considered deliberate and repeated. The numbers were clear. So were the surveillance timestamps. It wasn't a major executive, not someone from upper management or a person with stock options and boardroom access. It was someone far down the chain, a mid-level warehouse supervisor named Marisa Holloway, 38 years old, 2 years into her job at one of Musk's solar manufacturing facilities. No complaints, no write-ups, just a name that had never needed to cross his attention, until, now, Elon didn't respond right away. He just stared at the final page, a photo captured from a security camera. Marisa walking briskly through a side corridor with a sealed box pressed tightly to her chest. A box that had never been scanned, never logged, and never returned. The audit report estimated over $30,000 in lost parts over the past 3 months, all traceable to her. He called for a meeting that same evening. No lawyers, no middlemen, just himself, the security head, and Marisa. The tone was set before anyone walked in the room. When she arrived, she looked worn. Not the kind of worn that came from guilt, but the kind built from long days and heavier nights. Her uniform was clean, her expression unreadable, but the anxiety in her hands gave her away. She stood when she entered, unsure whether to sit, unsure if she was already fired. Elon didn't waste time with preambles. He asked one question, flatly: "Why?" The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Marisa looked at the floor, then at the glass of water placed in front of her, then at Elon, and still said nothing. The head of security began to speak, but Elon raised a hand. He didn't want procedural facts. He had those. He wanted the truth from her, if there was one. Finally, Marisa exhaled. She didn't try to deny it. She didn't stutter or fabricate. What she said next didn't come out defensive or desperate. It came out exhausted. She told him about her son, 16 years old, diagnosed with a rare bone condition that required monthly injections not covered by their insurance. She told him about her husband's car accident last year and the mounting hospital bills they hadn't been able to pay off. She told him how she tried everything: extra shifts, online fundraisers, applying for aid that never came. She had managed to hold it together for almost a year, until she couldn't anymore. The parts she stole weren't random. She sold them, piece by piece, to a third-party recycler, someone who never asked questions. She didn't take cash from registers. She didn't skim off salaries. She took only what she believed she could replace eventually. She thought she could pay it back, cover the costs quietly, and survive the year. But it didn't happen that way. Elon said nothing as she spoke. His expression didn't shift, not even once. The room around them, normally a space of cold, fast decisions, was suspended in a stillness neither of them expected. When she finished, there was nothing else to say. She lowered her eyes again, this time not in shame, but in finality. She knew what was coming. She had already accepted it. The silence lingered. Elon leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the woman in front of him. Marisa didn't plead. She didn't cry. There was no performance, no desperate appeal for sympathy. What struck him most was the stillness in her voice, like someone who had already mourned the loss of her job, her reputation, and possibly her future. Her confession hadn't been a strategy. It had been a surrender. For a man whose world revolved around precision, data, and control, Elon found himself unsettled. Not by the theft itself, but by the reality that this woman, buried in the folds of a company that spanned continents, had been drowning while everyone, never saw it. Her actions were wrong, yes, but the picture she painted was not of greed. It was survival. He asked her another question, this time quieter. How much had she actually made from what she sold? Her answer came without hesitation. Barely a third of what the parts were worth. She had no leverage, no network, no ability to negotiate, just desperation. And a buyer who knew exactly what kind of person he was dealing with. That stung more than the theft itself. The head of security, who had remained silent for most of the exchange, shifted in his seat. He reminded Elon that company policy was clear. Theft resulted in immediate termination and could include prosecution. Precedent mattered, especially with a workforce this large. Letting one case slide opened the door for others. Elon didn't respond right away. His eyes were still on Marisa, who sat unmoved. She didn't flinch at the mention of prosecution. She had already decided to take whatever consequence came. But something began to turn in Elon's mind. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't some sudden surge of sentiment. It was something else, something deeper. This wasn't about setting an example for the rest of the company. It was about what kind of example he wanted to respond with. Punishment was easy. Expected even. But what would it fix? What would it teach? That desperation made people disposable? That circumstance didn't matter if rules were broken. Elon finally stood, not looking at Marisa but pacing slowly to the glass wall overlooking the city. Night had fallen outside, the distant traffic buzzing below. He stayed there for a moment, hands in his pockets, thinking. When he turned around, his voice was firm but even. He asked Marisa one final question. What did she think should happen next? Her eyes lifted for the first time since walking in. She didn't beg for mercy. She didn't ask for her job. She said she understood the weight of what she did. That she didn't expect forgiveness, only that he understood why it happened. That if her firing was the cost of keeping her son alive, she was willing to pay it. That answer hit differently. She wasn't defending herself anymore. She was laying herself bare. And suddenly, the idea of following policy felt hollow. The head of security, still seated at the edge of the room, was watching Elon closely now. He knew that look, the one Elon got when a decision was forming, not from protocol, but from instinct, something deeper than the ledger or the law. Elon moved slowly, stepping back to his seat, fingers interlaced, elbows on the table. He said nothing for a while. Then quietly, he asked Marisa if she had ever considered asking for help. The question wasn't loaded, but it landed heavy. Her answer was short. She had. She'd tried reaching out, once, to a supervisor for a temporary pay advance. It was declined, flagged by payroll. The company had policies. The rules were inflexible. She hadn't pushed it further. She knew how. People looked at employees who couldn't hold it together privately. Weakness was risky. The room grew colder with that admission. Elon sat back in his chair, staring across the table, not at Marisa, but at the structure that had allowed this to happen without anyone noticing. She had slipped through every crack, not because the system was broken, but because it was too rigid to bend when it mattered. He looked at the head of security, then back at Marisa, and finally spoke. She wasn't going to be fired. The words hung in the air, met with stunned silence. He told her she would be placed on an unpaid leave while the stolen funds were recovered, either through restitution or structured deductions. She would receive financial counseling, access to the company's emergency assistance fund, and, more importantly, a meeting with HR to begin the process of applying for extended medical support for her son. The head of security opened his mouth, likely to object, but stopped himself. This wasn't up for discussion. Elon didn't do it out of softness. There was nothing soft about the way he spoke. It was a correction, not just to Marisa's mistake, but to the company's failure to see her, to care enough to make a call. When the numbers first looked strange, to notice the signs of a person slipping between responsibilities and desperation. Marisa didn't react immediately. Her eyes blinked once, and her mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no words came. For a long moment, she just sat there, overwhelmed by a wave of disbelief. Not because she had been forgiven, but because someone had finally seen the full picture and chose not to reduce her to a single wrong decision. Elon dismissed the meeting after that. No drawn-out apology, no lectures. Just a firm, direct conclusion. There would be a process, and she would be expected to follow every part of it. But she would not be discarded. She would not be shamed. Outside the meeting room, the building was quiet. Late enough now that most employees had already gone home. Marisa walked slowly through the corridor, her steps lighter than when she'd entered, but still cautious, still unsure if what had happened had truly happened. For the first time in months, the knot in her stomach began to loosen. Elon remained. Behind, alone, looking once more at the file on his desk. Then he slid it into a drawer and shut it with a soft click. He knew this wouldn't be the last time he'd face something like this. But maybe, just maybe, the next person in her position wouldn't have to steal to be heard. Days passed quietly. Marisa didn't return to the floor, as instructed. But she wasn't gone either. Her name still appeared in the system, her employee badge still worked, and her email still received messages. Word traveled fast through the warehouse, but no one knew the full story. Rumors circled about theft, suspension, and a private meeting with Musk himself, but no one dared ask her directly. She had vanished from sight, but not from thought. For Elon, the matter didn't fade. It lingered, not just as an anomaly in the chain of operations, but as a reminder of what the company's scale could obscure. He kept thinking about how easy it would have been to react the way most executives would. Swift termination, legal follow-up, public distancing. And yet he kept returning to that moment when she confessed, not as a criminal trying to escape blame, but as a mother trying to survive a quiet war no one else could see. A week after the meeting, Elon made a decision. He called for an internal review, not just of Marisa's department, but of every warehouse, every satellite team, every small cog in the machine. Not for fraud, not for theft, but for signs of pressure. Missed shifts, declined pay advance requests, repeated medical leave applications. He asked for names, not to punish, but to reach. The data came back heavier than expected. Dozens of names, not all in crisis, but close enough. Quiet desperation, spread thin across a massive workforce. People living in cars, supporting sick family members, taking on secret second jobs. The kind of stories no company policy was designed to notice. That was when he created something new. A hardship access line staffed by humans, not machines. A short-term emergency fund, not managed by layers of approval, but by a small trained team capable of acting fast, quietly, with dignity, not charity, but recognition. That in a world filled with innovation, empathy couldn't be a feature. It had to be a foundation. Marisa, after 2 weeks away, returned to the facility. She kept her head down, resumed her duties, but something was different. Not just in her, but in how others looked at her. No one treated her like a criminal. If anything, there was a kind of quiet respect. Not because she had gotten away with something, but because she had stood in front of it all, confessed, and walked back in stronger. She worked harder than before. Not to repay a debt, but because she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Worth. That her job meant something. That she mattered, not just in the output she gave, but in the life she carried behind her badge. As for Elon, he never spoke publicly about the decision. No tweet, no press release. He didn't need to. This wasn't about optics. It was about course correction. A few months later, an envelope arrived on his desk. Inside was a photo of Marisa's son, smiling in a hospital room, arm bandaged, holding a gift from his mother. A note was attached. Just one line, handwritten. "Thank you for seeing what no one else did." Elon placed the photo in the same drawer where he'd once locked away her case file. This time, though, the drawer stayed slightly ajar. Not every story about failure had to end in loss. Some ended in recognition, some in repair, and every once in a while, one ended in redemption.